puji taranze yen lai zhu chu yang din sum zhu tar chere zhoi nyun mo nyi long le je chang zhu chol se jing ma re mun se le tung a lai nyun ko ye chi nye che ze ral chi nam de ne da jing sa chu tar sun yun den lu zo yal se tu we ku chu chai chu dan chu nye gen de da lu mun se jambe yan la de arabadana 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 Marabazana de 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 Marabazan Marabazana de Zedin ke je ken rabo sere jin dalu timo mimba rasalani Kadang ten ju shung lung tong pa yi lo zhu po bi nong wa ye za len du solo kang ce da wa ren du pa ham chung se ji wa ren du na yang Gombo jam yang chen ye ne ke me pa yang tong wa rai shou 민제 신부도 되는 신 손에 문엄 진봉아 야당 배가 당한 선도 실면도 돈바 도제 진나 차다 우전 성능 변면 동보대 열외 남조 정신 현재도 선도 변진 연된 통바와 배마 중내 달러 배들 루종 동매 아리아 대와다 인연 종랑 천재 장면상 연된 여다 현재 외랑서 개조 전에 남나서 와대 마외생의 관계를 배매 세들론의 상생 군세 장안 참배 바지를 되세 군예 랑숨 중에 선보 자료제 강리 토갈 렌제 님배용고는 연행 군종 가위에 계산도 님배된도 배배 나저바 농신 ramcham 샤라서 와데 리돈 점불 신내 지라블에 공비롱내 보배들 예로 롱도 천재 장성아 왕지로 미팜장형 남절라서와 대배 오면 최지 인계 보장내 두숨 상제 군징 어원이 랑숨 중공 웃음 던세바 자외람면 샤라서와 대 대양 로반 남기 타단년 베심전 탐제 동아리 윤제 예당 잘데 톱자 난남메 바양다 바라 조비 산제제 고방 정보체라 고바르기고 대체도 담배체 대년 선진 수리신도 냠수 렘바르기고 냠베 삼바 창주 쇼도 토케바 정보체 살다베 고네 sem바르슈 강 sem바르차비 최게 림바네 네 케비 출라 주빈고 셰자와 덴제 디네레 네 딜라양 죄자 된데 케비네 주 안에 최기 동시 소소 양답을 리바시 안데 숨게 예배나네 당보 케비네 주디게 나란 디 케비네 주디라 양 되네 당보 풍보라 케바 디 까라레데 풍보데라 양 에나 나 예배나네 당보 안에 풍보데라 에나 양 되네 속당 처바 두제 나서 바이베나니다 니바 소리 풍복감을 냅대요.
At the beginning of class, please give rise to bodhicitta, thinking, may all sentient beings who are as numerous as the sky is vast be free of suffering and the causes for suffering, and may I be able to establish them at the level of perfect and complete awakening, the state of a perfect Buddha, the ultimate accomplishment. And in order to be able to do so, may I study and put the teachings correctly into practice. So with that kind of motivation, please listen to the teachings. The text that we're studying in this class is the Gateway to Knowledge, the treatise entitled The Gate for Entering the Way of a Pandita, and which was written by Mipam Rinpoche. The text is divided into 3 main sections that discuss the 10 topics of expertise, the 4 seals of Dharma, and the 4-fold correct discrimination, respectively. We're currently discussing the first one of those, the 10 topics of expertise, and within those we're currently discussing the first one, which are the aggregates. The aggregates are 5. So the aggregate of form, the aggregate of sensation, the aggregate of perceptions, formations, and consciousness. And out of those, we have completed the first one, the aggregate of form, and now we're currently discussing the second, sensations.
Today, data nyamdola data dangong tiwa dinzo la yebe tiwa number reach might be called like get at thingmani libidos the destiny get at lepson the kindness in the did one de dos dordu of the she and chela young number reach might be so the countries lamne todoyang dos motor jeva doji the she well then thingmani don't let you
There were some questions yesterday, and one was again about imperceptible form and why it turns up twice. So here we can say that imperceptible form is first mentioned in the mental object as a summary, just a brief introduction that this exists, and then the detailed explanation of it follows below.
tene dulde cheru checheru drobe jungong dawde da kadere dawje sun dade jungong dawde da tanda denimala charab dulsing jere de dulde 좀나 ane je dulchen da jakchu jakdul dün 좀송나 아니 추들 다는 신바 신도 야 공리 공도 별바데 다 메파르모지도 켄주나나 송레 다데 메파르모지 송에 대양 로빈 잉니기 공경 um바 전남나양 야데 지고 지양지 송여레 근데 지딩게 리당 리랍당 강바 김 속탐제게 좀시게 둘친 레스 데 둘친 임바데네 만에 양 dulchen tangne deshindo chakshu ribo lokdang lang nisir doldang soma dang dele chung dang deshindo ane chi sorsik sheja gongdun gyurur sinen dine chine sorma dang sikda ya gongni gongdo danje kenjung nala lewa nangshin raw chine yang dine sumgyo re sene lobi inye ki sungne dine lobi inye kongge dine zo sangye ki do dunzo nangla sung shakyo da dinzo ge 공바데 안에 마탈네 당원 버주된도 제능게로 근데 대한시ang 상계경 도남라 결론다 수 여진 수수 롱와 롱웨 대치 수 녀버nembe 풍보성지 여레스 네 송디가라다 데디 조수 수기 풍보콜라 계자시와데 제도디 수기 풍보데 콜라 계자시나 수기 단다 메방 뭐체다 단다 로베히냐 콩나 버서게다 수기 풍보데나 수기 풍보데라 엔나 유숙 중화침보 시당 아니 대숙 축직선의 용교를 대숙 축지되게 남라 아니 최기 깨체빠이 수나라 둘타랍대 유대게래 둘타랍대 디디가라다 상계계야다 개롱 돌레스 개롱다 수 여진 수수롱외 대체를 수 녀버림비 풍보스네 나 도나나데 숨을 상계계 숨을 로비에 좀 대미 바로 뭐지 숨 텐데다 돌체 자와니네 규로메 바 딱바 아니 지 딘데직다 켈링게 말에 단 돌체 뭐보 좀시 임바지 다 내값이 딘데스 켈렌 남기도와 단단하데 돌체 잠당된 좀 딘데 인스 라바모보 딘조 풍고 딘조 랩당된 딘데 인스 다디 돌체인데 요발라 때네 되네 왕봉아 되네 치로게 되는가 아니 딜라 징킹게 심 어딘데서는 딱이제 돌진데 메송나 치료게 소블라 소바 용게 말에 디 메송나 디 징킹게 셈스네 용 말에 디 메송나 징킹게 셈야메 되네 디 율라메 되네 뭐번에서 가야 용게 말에 돌진데 여나 되네 되네 좀네 되네 탐제 용기도 와
Then we had another question, which was with regard to the presentation of particles that we saw, how these particles accumulate together and then make up bigger and bigger units of particles. So going from the most subtle indivisible particle to then particles, and then 7 of these making up the iron particles, and then water particles, and so on. And the question was then what the source for this kind of presentation is, where we can we find that. And the exact presentation as Mipam Rinpoche gives it here is based on the presentation that we find in the Abhidhamma Kosha by Vasubandhu. He describes exactly that, all the mountains like Mount Meru, but also the appearances or the things in the world like houses and tables and so on. Everything is based on the conglomeration of these smallest indivisible particles that then 7 of them coming together being forming a particle, and that forming a iron particle, water particle, and so on. I can provide you with the exact quote from the Abhidhamma Kosha later on. And so that presentation by Vasubandhu in the Abhidhamma Kosha is the source for the way it's presented in the Gateway to Knowledge. Vasubandhu himself bases himself on some comments from sutras. In one sutra, the Buddha says that all form is based on the coming together or the conglomeration, the aggregation of these smallest indivisible particles, and that forming together then builds up coarse form. And so there are sutras like that that speak generally about the aggregates and aggregation, but also mention then these smallest indivisible particles, and Vasubandhu puts that into the coherent system of how these particles, when they accumulate, build different kinds of bigger units of particles. And so that is then in the discussion of the aggregate of form, where we have the causal forms and the resultant forms. And one of the resultant forms are the mental objects, and there we find exactly that, right? There we find the smallest indivisible particles as one of the mental objects, and that we find in the sutras as being the building blocks, the basis for building up more coarse kinds of phenomena. So that's where this comes from. Now, when we talk about these particles, then we shouldn't think of them as completely changeless and permanent and so forth. That's not what is meant with these particles. But we can think of them as just temporarily, and the way that we conceive of the building up of coarse phenomena, that it breaks down into these smaller particles, this flux of smaller and smaller units. And it is necessary to present them as the building blocks for forms, for physical forms, because of perception. So it's due to the coming together of the physical form or the object. The object would not be possible without it being the accumulation of smaller and smaller units, as we see when we break it down. So we have the object like that, then the faculty, which is also physical, and then the consciousness. And so for any kind of cognition or cognitive process to happen, of the appearance of certain of these objects, the perception of these objects, there needs to be something to come into contact with. So the argument here would then be that if there were no smallest indivisible, if there wouldn't be any smallest particles, then there wouldn't be an object that is the accumulation of these smallest particles. There would also not be a faculty, and therefore there couldn't be any cognition of these objects arise at all. And it's only because we conceive of the basic building blocks for these phenomena to arise, then that based on that we can experience, or we can talk about the cognitive process of observing these objects.
네, 지와직대 수기 초르와당 semgi chorwa, sugi chorwa dang semgi chorwa kanderes dinde kejashi lepsun zo ta lyugi tone chorwa leken tenzo sugi chorwa sin lyugi gone je mikita ane sugi zewo tom tene je 되게 야보 남이 냠수 지 용동나 다데 땅 아니 류기 양 렉자 덴제 렉네 딜라 양 렉비 고네 양 율기 안에 코롱기 제 잠보다오 양나 주보다오에나 셈동안 잠보다오에나 셈대와 덴데게 초르투나 다데 류기 고네레스 데네 셈게 톨라 양 셈게 톨라 내출 게차 kaya rongwaji semge shene de la ane sem zu sawe che la ane de netul de la ane keche de dane keche yako dao soso yidan tumba dao ji lepsong na sem de ge chorwa yako dao ji yang de netul de la sem de ge rek ne sem de tuk ne netul de nyamdo la sem ge shene ne de sem되게 다제 나오지 다 그런 sem기 젠이로와 sem기 학원이로와 아니 율 그런 게 캐줘야 양 마티보다 오셔서나야 동알와라 다오던데 류 숙초라서는 소 맥당 nen초당 나당 젤레당 류당 어딘데 거네 lep켄 된족에 딘조조 진에 lep켄 된족에 초르와다 네 류소르당 안에 된조 많이 받제 심 코롱기 통에 lep겐 된조 기밍라 심소르스 간다랑 심델라 안에 내술 가야 리바지 심게 하고 심게 디냠둘라 딱제당 디제라 코 이제 거기 케주도 개발하고 남주로 돼 nyongma daute tene namjuru daute tene yako dauji la tendesne nyongge na lusor dewas set mare semsor dewas tene kale khapo dauji nyongma daut kale khapo number dauji la semde chasuna de kale khapo chawi semde ge mingla chorwa dongal nyongwas naso
Then we had a question with regard to these sensations, especially the distinction of the sensations of the sense experiences, and then the sensation of the mind, so the mental pleasure. We were talking about pleasure and suffer, or pleasure and pain, and mental pleasure and mental pain, and that distinction. How do we need to conceive that? How do we need to understand this distinction? And how do these different kinds of sensations then arise? Like, what's their relationship to each other in a successive or individual way? And so the pleasant and painful sensation of the body, so of the physical sensations, meaning that which arises based on the contact of the object and the faculty, they're one category. And then the sensation that arises through the contact of the mind, through, like in the mind, that is then a different sensation. And so it's mental pleasure, it's mental pain that is identified here as a distinct kind of sensation. So when we talk about the pleasant and pleasure and pain, just in terms of the sense experiences, and this refers to the sensation that arises based on the encounter with an object of the senses. So if we see a beautiful poem with our eyes, then we conceive of that as good. Like, if it's something that we will conceive of as good, as something beautiful, then with the encounter arises the sensation of it being pleasurable. We will then identify that as good. So equally, when our body faculty comes into contact with some texture that is very soft or something rough, accordingly, with the cognition of that arises the sensation of it being pleasurable or painful. So if we touch something really soft, then this is something, the cognition of that arises, has then the experience, includes the experience of pleasure. That's the sensation of pleasure for the body. And so the mental pleasure then is everything that is not the experience of the physical faculties or through the physical faculties, but what is experienced then in the mind consciousness, not directly based on the faculties. So this can be in accordance with the previous experiences. So when the mind then thinks about what is experienced, conceptualizes it, knows something as being good or bad, or giving it different kinds of labels, then accordingly the mind, based on what is experienced by the sense cognitions previously, is then conceived of as good or bad. And so that also brings along everything that is not a direct experience of the senses, brings with it also the sensations of pleasure, pain. So any thought or experience of the mind that is not the direct experience of the sense consciousnesses, that is then this mental pleasure or mental pain as a sensation. And so the physical sensations here, the pleasant and the pleasure and the pain, the physical sensations, they are mainly based on the sense experiences, while everything else is identified as that which is known by the mind, which is an object of the mind, and that can be then be the object which is mentally analyzed, or what one knows certain aspects and expressions about. And those kinds of images in the mind, those kinds of things, objects that are being analyzed and conceived of by the mind consciousness, they can also be experienced as pleasurable or painful. So those can have all sorts of different aspects.
데 얘기 셰바디게 데 초당대양 예 얘기 셰발라 다는 얘기 셰발라 넘바데 주 넘바데 샤용데 갑라 쳐 가양 로마지 넘바 샤 딜라 얘기 셰바게 레 디칸데레도 스네 따네 디네 율데라 이동와이나 디네 초르와야고 예도 명와이나 초르와도보 니가라 땅뇽도 다딘데 종유레스
So the mental sensations, they then follow this the same principle. Anything that appears as an object to the mind consciousness comes into contact with the mind consciousness in this way, or is experienced by the mind consciousness, then functions as the object for the mind consciousness, which also is experienced as a pleasurable, painful, or neutral sensation.
So, tene migi sheba, na sheba, tene chele sheba, tene lugi shebas, ani di chele yang yigi shebas. Tenzo tamje de da zosemsen, tenzo de zosemsen lamna, ji pena nenchogi cha bogi na pena cha sam zimye dongji zosemsen. Tene di chela di zosem de tang nyamdula, tene semjung sen de semji. 거의 코르라 냠둘라 요와지 대원디기 안에 딱제 땅인데 갈라더니 자디기 개체 개발선 개발 님보두당 안에 만님보 제도당 땅뇽 제도당 스네 랍네 초르켄지 디네 셈중 개체 심긴지기 안에 딘데스네 셈중지 열에서 어디 초르켄 하고긴지 어디기 명라 개발하고긴지 자년부도 자도부도 자당용래도래 베나 첼레게 셰바데게 조셈데게 첼레게 셰바데게 좋아 용네 아니 디 조셈레다 디당 냠둘라 아니 셈중 초라생지 열에서 디 초라데게 아니 디 단다데 직당 좋아 로데다 냠둘라 레용데 갑라 따제 땅위고네 되네 로코롱기 율기 개발돼 좋아 야고드나 좋아 야고 제도스네 초토게 좋아 두부여나 좋아 두부도스네 초토게 되네 좋아 로데 땅뇽이나 로 좋아데 땅뇽이나 땅뇽이 바 초토게 어딘데게 된게 개발되라 야와 책임지게 된자이스네 심중 초로와생지 열에스네 숨네 다디 다는 신기다 이라양 이게 셰바데기 이기 셰바당 냠둘라 되네양 된기 개발은 경기 심중 초로와생지 열에서 이기 최가야롱마지 이기 송사회 제라 렉네 데딜라 용수 제비고네 되니 율코롱기 아니 개발 개체 대화제나 대화 동아리나 동알 땅님이나 땅님들의 초토경기 어떤데스는 셰바지 여스는 송아래다 심중 다딘도양 마오네 칼레레게다 간드랑 탄다 노트이다고 지나스.
When we speak about the sense consciousnesses of the eye consciousness, the ear consciousness, the nose consciousness, the tongue consciousness, and the body consciousness, then those are, and in addition to that also the mind consciousness, then these are identified as the main mind, the main mind, aspects of the main mind, which recognizes the object, its own particular object, which cognizes that. It's a mere cognition of, for example, sound by the ear consciousness. But along with the main mind, or the aspects of the main mind, that cognition, then also come these mental states. And that is then which perceives of the particularities of what the main mind perceives. So along with the cognition of sound, the ear consciousness, also comes that which then distinguishes that sound to be pleasurable, painful, or neutral. So it's like something that comes along with the main mind, a mental state that distinguishes then the feelings, the sensations that are, or like the distinguishment, that which distinguishes those as being either pleasurable, painful, or neutral, or experiences them as pleasurable, painful, or neutral, is then this mental state that comes along with the main mind. And here that is what is labeled as sensations, that the specification of distinguishing the object in terms of being pleasurable, painful, or neutral. And so when taste, for example, is experienced, so there's a taste, it's the object, and that is come in contact with, and due to the cognitive process of coming into contact with that taste, then along with the recognition of taste comes, or the cognition of the taste, comes the sensation of pleasure, pain, or neutrality. So it's that really which distinguishes or betrays the distinction in the particularities of that object in terms of whether it's pleasurable, painful, or neutral. That is the sensation of pleasure, pain, or neutral. That are the sensations that can be either pleasurable, painful, or neutral. So we need to think of it in terms of the main mind and a mental state that comes along with that cognition. The same holds true for the mind consciousness. Whatever the mind consciousness perceives as its object, that is when the mind consciousness conceives of something as its object, then that can, the mere cognition of that's the main mind consciousness, but along with that also comes the sensation, which is that which is to be distinguished, or which distinguishes the experience, that cognition, as being pleasurable, painful, or neutral. So this is just to summarize it very briefly, but we will talk about this more in the future.
Ne mutune dangong tene mala dela tedu tangyung sumje ewe ye nyawar yuwe sewa chorwa chobje do gyuros dibado shusene shenyang yang chorwa dela ena ego edang shiba edang kaga gune ena yang luchor singje dang semchor singje ni yösen sungare 아는 luchor singde shenyang 공아이 시에바당 총된 규백이 셈디 군이 철화되라 총딩기 셈디기 초르와 디가 명라 리소스네 라고요스 공의 셰바스 공의 셰바스 미기 셰바당 총딩기 유르비기 선중되기 초르나 류기 초르와레 nenchogi sheba dang chungding de yurbegi semjung chorwa de chorna lychor re dana she nai sheba ani dana she chile sheba dana she gi lyugi sheba dang chungden sing de maola ke je sungido 총방하데 다다디 sheba de dang chorwa ni de 총방하den ge gone yosam sungyo 디 총딩이 권에 초르나 류초르레스 미기 셰바이 당 총된 나나 질레 류지 권에 된데 총딩 권에 되네 초르와시 계속나 디 초르와 된조 류초르싱이네스 되네 양 이셰당 이기 셰바당 총방가 총기 권에 양 초르와 셈중대 이셰기 코드 규베 셈중대 계속나 디 셈중 초르와 딩명나 셈초르 라게 요레스 yang ego edang odines yores lyusor singji dang semsor sing ta dinzo yang ego de zo de lyug chorwa ji dang sing gi chora yang dila yang 대화 동al tang nyung de ta yo karwa ta jigwa re do dang dinzo tanda di yang ego de lyusor singji dang semsor singji ni la sha song ta ta na ya gang la yang ego kashi yang kan na tin gi ko ni ewas मेगी नंबर शिवे दुइदे जुमे छोरवा लागे नवे नंबर शेबा नए नंबर शेबा जे नंबर शेबा लुगी नंबर शेबा येगी नंबर शेबा ले जुमे छोरवा सने yang tenji कोने छोरवा ला yang छोरवा जुक से 어디 샤소 어디 낭신치네 다 단다 두루 yang lügi छोरवा जे 당 sem기 छोरवा ni la ewa chene yang lüzor 당 semser기 कोने 샤야 여스네 단데스네 수마레도
So if we now continue from where we had left off yesterday, the last thing we looked at were the 18 types of sensations accompanying a cognitive act. And so to move on then, today we are on page 22, paragraph 1.27. Moreover, there are various types such as physical sensations concurrent with cognitions of the five sense doors, mental sensations concurrent with mental cognitions, and so forth. So there are other ways of classifying sensations than the ones that we have seen so far. Here we're distinguishing into two types, the physical sensations, and they're identified as those that come along with the cognitions of the five sense doors. So with the sense cognitions, the sense consciousnesses. So with the eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, and body consciousness, come when these cognitions, these consciousnesses arise, along with them, concurrent with them, come the physical sensations. So they're all grouped together into the category of physical sensations. And so this is a way to break it down in terms of the physical or the mental basis for those sensations. And we call them concurrent here because they come along with all of these cognitive acts. So here, concurrent with the eye consciousness is then the sensation of the eye consciousness that comes along with, or that is concurrent with the eye consciousness. There's a type of sensation that is concurrent to the ear consciousness. With the ear consciousness, there's a type of sensation that is concurrent with the nose consciousness, and so on. And then also concurrent, then there is a different type, the counterpart, which is then the sensations that are concurrent with the mind consciousness. And it says here concurrent with the cognitions, either of the five sense doors or the mental cognitions, because these are identified, like this is something identified as concurrent mental states, those that come along with all cognitive acts, whether it's the senses or the mind consciousness. And we will see that in the discussion of the mental states and formation. Formation is one of those that come first. Sensations is one of the mental states that is concurrent with all acts of cognition, either of the 5 sense doors or the mental cognitions in the way that is broken down here. So in our list of 18 different sensations, we broke it down based on the cognition, the support for that cognition. The I consciousness being the support along with which the sensation, pleasurable, painful, or neutral sensations can be experienced, and so on. So there we looked at each particular support. Here we're grouping them together in a different way. Here the classification is made on the basis of cognitions that arise, the cognitions of the sense doors, so the eye consciousness and so on, so all the physical senses, the cognitions that arise from the physical senses, and apart from that, then also the mental consciousness, the mental cognition, and the sensations that are concurrent with the mental cognition. So here we have a twofold distinction into the physical and the mental cognitions. And each of them can then, of course, also again be further subdivided. Each of them can contain pleasure, pain, and neutral sensations.
나 류초르 생이제 계제지 레벨로 류초르 당 셈소르스는 류기 초르와 있나 아니 류기 시에발레 짱바 중에 내 인구 말에스 류기 초르와 있나 류기 시에발레 류시엘레 짱바 중에 인구 말에스 베나 류시 류디기 뭐고 된돌라 렉네 ane je rekpa ha kone ane di dang nyam dula tene je chorgi yorwa o tene sene tene lyu chori inna lyu gi rekpa kyangba yin lyu she le kyangba chungwa kyangba yin ko mares nen chogi yang ane je tra nyimbo ma nyimbo la so ge chor chogi res di lyu she le tene chungwa mares di yang nen chogi shebale tene chungwa ode 다 류소리 있나 류셰 rekpale kyangpa chungwa yinko mares 류소리 있나 믹셰레 때네 숙셰발레 때네 중게레 자셰발레 때네 중게레 아니 어디레스네 유레레 게저레 류소리 있나 류셰 kyangbal레 류기 셰바서 rekpa kyangbal레 때네 중고 말에 속에 통화 때네 내조 자 고가 된데 보내 초라 유레레 게저 인
So here it is important to understand that the physical sensations do not only refer to the sensations of the body consciousness that is experienced through touch, through touching or through some sort of contact with a tangible object or a texture. But physical sensations here refer to all the physical senses. So this is also referring to the experience of the I, the cognition, the I consciousness, the cognitive process that is being experienced through the I faculty meeting with an object, a form, visible form, and then the arising of the I consciousness that is also included in the physical sensation, same sound, so the ear consciousness, and so on. So physical sensations here refer to all the physical senses, the cognitions of the physical senses, rather than only physical in terms of the body sensations. So it's not only the sensations that the body consciousness experience based on touch, on coming into contact with a tangible object.
tene mutune dene lula ne seba dan chungdung gi chorwa la sangsing dan chebi chorwa as yang seba dan medim ba de gila sangsing mebi chorwa as yang dende sangsing dan chebi chorwa dan sangsing mebi chorwa sing ji yures kadi de zo lula lu chorla dene sha ur lula pena lula pe jejin chenbo lula pe kanang chenbo chegen so so lula pe cha chenbo jingen dende kansa ge an lula pe mese ge sepa do kiene lula chakpa do lula pe kanang chenbo do kiene diri kaptela tene chung yonggen ge lula pe mese ge chenbo lula pe kanang chenbo lula ji ma seung lu kyang lu ji cheng ni cheng se mang bo shuk chumbo pe mese mang bo sam dena dende ge kone dene chorwa denzo lepsong na de sangsing da chibi chorwa yang seba dang medemba sangsing mebe chorwa de pena chajumba namba chorla pena lula ane lula jambo ge chorwa zubo ge chorwa tangyum ge chorwa dende seneta nyongna yang dila yang je pe mesen pe chorwa pena luda pe cha chimbo chini lula pe kolak jambo do lepsona ta pe yagala sene pe chorwa shuk chimbo do semgi chorwa mangbo chigin do yang lula ane di chorwa mati bola sana tene chorwa pe mati bo do samne yang di pangthap do mangbo chie do dinde sem chorwa mangbo do dinde yo mares lebe ke jere ta trachumba lakche trachumba den jorwa 풍보 학마다 제바유베 다좀바 남바서 다 수보라 차바빵 차이 되가라 처르와 대둑 라소바 된조 라 빵낸 된조 흉충보 마체베게 된데게 처르와 예면은 상세메베 처르와스 되는 소소게 된조 르라 처르와 되는 상생망보 제비고네 된데 대둑 라소바 망보 처르게 아니 상생다 제비 처르와스 된데야 지예레 수마레
There are also some other types of sensations, and those are mentioned here as turbulent sensations concurrent with physical craving, and sensations free from turbulence which are not concurrent with craving. And the way that we should understand these two types of sensations, the turbulent and the not turbulent sensations, they have to be understood as follows. So if someone has a lot of physical craving and is busy considering the needs of the body all the time, so this is someone who would cherish the body very much, thinking that the physical experiences are extremely important, are something that occupies their minds all the time because they cherish their body so much, so they're so attached to their body and their physical experiences that they would be always occupied with the physical sensations of the body, always thinking about how to keep warm, how to protect the body from any kind of unpleasant sensations, any harm, any tiniest painful experience or experience a sensation that is painful or not pleasurable. So someone who's occupied so much with the physical sensations of the body, that refers to turbulent sensations, because that is completely disturbing or occupying that person's being. So when one is so occupied with the necessity for physical sensations, physical experiences to be good, to be never painful, never not pleasurable. And so that's the first type of sensation, these turbulent sensations that come together with the craving for physical pleasure. And the second one, the sensations free from turbulence, which are not concurrent with craving, are then the sensations that are experienced by an arhat, for example. Arhats have diminished their grasping to their bodies, their attachment and cherishment of their physical body. So whether they come into contact with something very soft or something very rough, their minds do not get obsessed with these sensations. They can stay. They do not get influenced by this pleasure, by the sensations of pleasure, pain, or neutrality, because they are not occupied with the physical pleasure of the body, and so they do not engage in. They do not try to get circumstances of physical pleasure all the time, or they don't spend their time trying to avoid or get rid of any kind of painful or not displeasure for the body. And so this refers to the arhats with remainder who still have aggregates, the remainders of aggregates. And so these arhats do not focus on abandoning all sorts of painful, physically painful or not pleasurable circumstances or experiences, and they're not occupied with trying to provide constant pleasure to their physical senses. And that's why their minds are not turbulent with those kinds of sensations. And so they do not have these turbulent sensations because they do not have this physical craving for always pleasure.
Then nga la sepa tang chungden shenpa tembe chorwa sengi tang yang shenpa mepa ngonjong tembe chorwa te la soba tene chorwa la namrang mangbo yore sin sungare den nga la se so cha ti ro rekcha den nga la se tene so jibo denzo ke sepa sin su ya boyo na de la de sepa chapa tang chu lang de tene su ngemba na de la pang de dan sen cha ti ro rekcha yongzo la ta yakko cha denzo rakna chi marong denzo dende sepa dende mambo kewe gone dende skewe gone chungden henba tembe chorwa sengde jungge yore sen chungden dende sepa mambo je yongde kapdela ante nyamdula ane semjung da khor dembe chungden sengde da chunggi do sa de sepa chigyo de tang chorwa ni de chunggi yore sen chungye de da chungdang de ngagi gone maone libire chungba ngaden sen 단다 데 초로와든도 심중래 데 조심남둘라 총당데 율총 안에 왕보총 된 왕보총 율총 뒤 다다와 총 남바데 진당총 어된 라소가 된데스네 총비고네 되네 셴바데 땜비 초로와사 안데네 되엔라 셴바데 안에 댄사 자우지게 된데게 댄사기 시 자우지라 서쪽이래서 된데게 서쪽인 게 초로와지 있을게 자리도 셴바 땜비 초로와스 아니양 셴바 메바 되네 파바 된조 되네 코로와 당 수그라 제로 예동와 된조라 셴바 메바 내중게 300권에 된조 동알기 제제게 유인바 캠비권에 되네 대랑 네바르 중위권에 네양 네바르 중화대 운도 중화 된조양 템보 용에게 초로와스 네 초로와스 근데 되는라 차바 빵와 고네 되게 차베 왕도라 메조와 대위 고네 되네 이제 어 되네 원중 땜비 서로와 생지 차베 왕도라 마조비기 시에바 문도 중외기 내중기 삼바도 문도 중외기 되게 때남 시제외기 서로와 쓰네 어떤 데서는 에와 속에 남랑 여도 송들
Then another way of, or another classification of sensations are the sensations that support clinging and are concurrent with the craving for the five sense pleasures, and sensations that support deliverance and are free from clinging. So there are many different ways of classifying sensations because there are so many different sensations. But one further way to classify them here is then in terms of the five sense pleasures. Those are the five sense objects that we crave for, that ordinary sentient beings crave for. So those are form, sound, smell, taste, and textures or tangible objects. And so when we perceive an object that we think of as nice, like a nice object, then we have that craving for such an experience. We crave seeing beautiful form. We think of it as good. Everything that's we conceive of as good, we crave for, we get attached to, we want to have it. That whole scenario, we really try to get a hold of these kinds of objects so that we have these pleasurable experiences. While the other objects which we do not think of as nice or pleasurable, that we don't experience as pleasurable, those we want to get rid of. We don't want to have them around us. We develop aversion and so on. But in this sense, the craving for either having them or the craving for distancing ourselves from them is this craving. So the sensations, the physical sensations, there are sensations can be categorized into those that are the basis for clinging, for more craving. And those are those that are based on our physical experiences, so based on our craving for sensual stimulation in terms of sight, smell, sound, taste, and touch. So that is what propels further clinging and further craving. And so the classification is based on the concurrence with the main mind. The sensation is concurrent with the main mind and either leads to further craving or a sensation that actually serves as the basis, and that's the second one here now, for developing renunciation and stabilizing one's renunciation, the wish for deliverance, and that is free from clinging to these sense objects. So if one then knows that that craving for what is pleasure, what is sensed to be pleasurable, and the craving for wanting for distance or aversion towards that which is experienced as painful, if one knows that these cravings lead to suffering, that the cause for suffering, this craving and attachment and aversion, then that as a sensation, like the sensations that serve as the basis for that, then are what makes our renunciation or just stable. They support the wish for deliverance, for liberation. They support that process of becoming free from suffering, and so they also the support. They're free from clinging to those sense objects and the sensations that arise from them. So here, the distinction is made on whether a sensation that is experienced leads to further clinging, further engagement with the sense objects, attachment and aversion, and so on, or whether it serves as the basis for renunciation.
풍부가 있는 초리 풍부대 휴신 말에 니바대 나 초리 풍부 시바대 조 다데 공아이 해바당 얘기 해바이 안에 코르도 주에 심중되기 되네 라난수도 율 강당 강나 레겐바 디기 케버데 징킹기 데 케버 징킹기 다지 셈되기 민라데네 초르와세 든지 케버랑도 다 미글라 미기 해바되게 쑥 난게레데 쑥데 초르게레데 이나 초르와서는 라기 말해 미기 해바되 냠도라 셈중 초르와생지요레스 다 코기 초르게요레스 된 다는 신게 nen초당 nen초기 셰바다 다는 신게 나이 셰바다 젤레 셰바다 류기 셰바 denso 탐제기 얘기 셰바 denso 탐제기 다 율데 초르게레 초르게 말해서는 하 고기레스 이나야 단다 조 누르 초르와 라긴데기 심중데 조 되는 율라 율기 케바르 짐바데 심중기 생이 인베 되네 율데 이도홍 매용 라소바 조 초르겐데 디 조심되기 냠둘라 다 심중 초르와 생지여레스 코르둘라 다 심중 갑중 아시스네 지에란데 마오네 레게레 심된졸라 조심된졸라 되네 코르라 심중 아중 아시스네 지에레 디난라 심중직 초르와 생이레 되네 단다 미기 셰바당 나이 셰바 제 셰바 류기 셰바 얘기 셰바 된조 민라 조심랍게레스 다 디기 코르라 된조 냠둘라 아니 심중 압중 아시스네 여레스 심중 맞중아지 디 심중 năng 데 초로와 쓰긴데 심중직레스 된데게 단다데 공회 셰바당 단다 얘기 셰바전 된쪽에 된기 쪼뭐 짐바 잠지 페나 미기나 페나 쑥 통와 잠지 다디 쑥데라 쑥 이도 홍와 쑥 이도 명와 쑥 땅뇽 nenchoge penna sheba dege tra yido honwa yido mewa sen dine zingken chorkende ena simjung chorwa sengje yore sene o tende sumare do nas.
So we have completed now the discussion of the second of the aggregates, the aggregate of sensation. And just to summarize again, the most important points here is that when we talk about sensation, then we talk about the main mind, the cognition of the sense cognitions, the five doors. So the eye consciousness, the ear consciousness, the nose consciousness, the tongue consciousness, and the body consciousness. And then also on top of that, the mind consciousness. Those are identified as the main minds. While then, in addition to that, we have the mental states that come along with the main mind. They're mental states that perceive particularities of what the experience. So we need to be careful with our language here. It is not the eye consciousness that experiences pleasure. The sensation is a mental state that arises along with the main mind of the I consciousness and the other consciousnesses too, but just as an example here. So when an object is being perceived by the I consciousness, if there is a cognitive act of perception of a visible form, then the mere recognition of the essence of the object, that is the I consciousness. That's the I cognition. And along with it comes the mental state, which is sensation. And that is then what differentiates the object to be pleasurable, painful, or neutral. So it is not the cognition itself, it's not the main mind, it's the mental state. So it's not the I consciousness that perceives something as pleasurable. And so that holds true for all the five senses and sense consciousnesses and the mind consciousness. And this is like the sensation here is one of 51 mental states that we will see later on in formation. So it's only one of 51 possible mental states that are the particularities that come along with the mental states, or can come along with the main mind. They're the mental states that accompany the main mind. And specifically here, sensation is one of those that are always accompanying the main minds. So together with the 6 consciousnesses, then come these 51 mental states. And sensation is one of these mental states. The main minds, the eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mind consciousness, they're just perceived in their essence of their particular objects. The identification or distinguishment, the distinguishing of whether the perceived object, like for example visible form, is then something that pleases or displeases or neither of them, us, is then the mental state of sensation. So that's really that which distinguishes the experience in this particular way based on pleasure, pain, and neutrality. The same with sound, the same with all the other sense objects being experienced. It's the main mind that only perceives the essence of the object, and the accompanying mental states, which are classified into 51 kinds. Those are the mental states that identify the particularities here for sensation, particularly the particularities whether an object is experienced as pleasure, pain, or neutral. Lesson.
Dichela dene sumba dushe ge phungbo ne se dushe ne chemar zimba des chemar zimba se na namba zimba se dedanti namba zimba na chemar zimba se dedanti namba kawai namba bumbai namba namba de zimba na chemar zimba des de la tengi gone enas tengi gone ena Miki dude rekpale jungwe dushe, nayu dude rekpale jungwe dushe, nayu dude rekpale jungwe dushe, che dude rekpale jungwe dushe, lugi dude rekpale jungwe dushe, yegi dude rekpale jungwe dushe sene, yegi partu chuk tambata, tengi kone ena, ten wango ngabo de la tenne, ane semar zimbe dushe de yang chok thamba chunga yores meke dude repa le chungwas meke 속 왕보 맥당 네 율 속당 아 근데 전 셰바 근데 초발라 때네 뒤대 아니 율들라 레김디 갑데라 아니 텔레 중위 되네 속에 넘바데 진용디 갑라 미케 뒤대 셰바 세 미케 두셰세와 안 다나 생게 되네 nenchok ta nenchok ke dute ane rekpa le chumala wangbo nenchok ke wangbo tang ane yul da tang ane shepa tende sum chone tene dala rekpa le se da de tu byong de kap de la ti de sene ane tende tham thumne chungwi ane duches semar zimba trai namba zimba o tanan shen chene tene truk thamba yores tengi wone.
Our next topic are then is the aggregate of perceptions. And here in paragraph 1.28, perceptions are defined as follows. Perceptions consist of the grasping to distinguishing features. So the identification of particularities of different aspects of the appearances then is referred to as perception here. So that which identifies or perceives the distinguishing features, the different aspects of the pillar or the vase, any object, is this aggregate of perceptions, that which grasps to or apprehends the distinguishing features. And we can divide perception in terms of the support. In terms of support, they can be divided into 6 types. Perceptions resulting from contact, the meeting of the eye, and so forth, until the mind. So when we divide perceptions, then we can do so based on the support, the 6 types there, and then there are 6 types of perceptions. The perception that arise based on contact that happens between a visible object and the eye faculty and the cognition, the eye consciousness. So the cognitive process that is included in vision, and so that kind of contact, everything that is included in the perception or the grasping to particularities based on sound, the experience of sound, cognitive process of sound, and so on. So all the 6 types of consciousnesses or cognitive processes based on the 6 types of objects then are can be the basis for distinguishing the 6 types of perceptions. So when we take the eye consciousness again as the example, then when there's the eye faculty, and there is the object, which is then the visible form, and there is cognition, there is cognition per se, then the coming together, the meeting of those, the contact between the object and the faculty, then leads to, in the presence of the cognition, then lead to the mental state of perception, which is the perception of the particularities of the form that is perceived. So the coming together of the object for visible form, the sense faculty of the eye, and the and cognition, those 3 together then lead to the experience of the perception of the eye, and with that then the like perception in the general sense, the cognition of the object, and along with that comes the perception of the particularities of that object. The same holds true then for the auditive experience. So there's the ear, which is the faculty, the sound, which is the object, and cognition. Then the meeting of these three, with these three conditions in place, and then the cognition of the form arises, of the sound arises, and along with that comes the perception of the particularities of the sound. So in this way, for each of the sense experience of the five senses and the mind consciousness, then we have these 6 different supports for perception that lead to the division into 6 types of perception based on the support for these perceptions to happen.
Yang dön la tsemar zimba ngoser so nangwa zimba dangse dön sena yul rana so ge yul tenzo la megi yul do jurwa penna so de la ngombo yana ngombo serbo yana su yako yana su dubo yana ip chechung rameta dang 어딘데 근데 다나신 자바야 자년 민년 라소바 대단 디다고 스네다 자년보 자면이보 스네 베나첼레라 좋아 심보 좋아 미심바 라소바 된도 된 코롱기 남바데 남바데 짐바르체바 몬보 세르보 세 라소바 된데 짐바르 남바데라 아니 돈라츠만 짐바스 디체라 양 탄년라 쳔버 짐바스 따단데 데 찍딜라 두시데라 에나 땡기보니 에당쟁야 도와 양 된가 쳔버 짐바스 지다 탄년라 쳔버 짐바스 어디레스군에 에 요레스네 탄년라 쳔버 짐바스는 밍라브레 된데기 밍 된데기 밍 로와 된데기 밍 쳔버 짐바데디 디 깨바오스 디 부메오스 디 땅 디 따고 디 바나모 디 캉바오 last but the destiny mingji di minglani kangbao di minglani dini kebu di minglani kebao di minglani pumeo dini di chala di minglani chokcheo di last over shi mangbu shi ra o denzo de o den destiny tanye zimba de tanye la du sheba tanye ge number zimba ji dang dönje number zimba ko ne ewa yores den sonde.
Furthermore, there are the perceiving distinguishing features in regard to sense objects, such as perceiving the appearance as being blue, yellow, and so forth, and perceiving distinguishing features in regard to names, such as perceiving man, woman, and so forth as being such. So another way of distinguishing perceptions is in terms of the object or the meaning itself and the conventions, the names that are given to things. So when we encounter a particular object, for example, visual form, visible form, then perception is that which identifies and grasps to the object's particular characteristics. So when we have form, for example, then that would be to recognize this visible form as being blue or yellow or according to its form shape, right? That it's round or square and so on. So that would be the perception in terms of the individual particularities of the object itself, the meaning of the object itself. And then the second type of perception is then to recognize and identify the particularities of an object in terms of the conventions or the names. So that would be then to not think, oh, this is blue, this is yellow, this is tasty, this is disgusting, all of these kinds of perceptions, but rather to identify things for according to their labels, according to their names. So the name that we give to the particular objects. So to recognize or to perceive and identify and think, oh, this is a girl, oh, this is a man, or this is a woman, oh, this is a house, this is a bed, this is a table, all these different identifications and the distinguishing phenomena based on their names and identifying them, thinking, oh, this is a woman, oh, this is a table, and so on. So the identification of these particularities based on the categories and the conventions that we apply to the appearances, the objects. That is then the second kind here of perceiving distinguishing features in regard to names.
남기 에와는 시제 정리도 쓴다샤래. 도단 에와드는 시제나 잖아. 신동 나서봐. 니마 다와 나서봐드는 잖아 빼만 보여라. 어디 시제가 장가 가지고 요나 대감 저기 안에 명당들이 전라들의 삼로당에 들에만 보지 시제장 가지고 요바 된데스는 유스는 숨말에 신양 양 천만의 집이 두세지 당 천만 매비 집이 두세스는 니 유스는다 그래. 천만의 집이 두세스인데 탄예람 니케바데 보고 충종대 속통나양 안에 디 속된조 통나양 속된조기 명하시는 달람 단다 장바 맞이네와 달람 마장베스 다메시바당 안에 체맥의 인생 동반이기 강라 냠바라 샤샤와 뭐보든 졸라 대단 디오스네 체만 마숨와 되네 디레다 양 시비 제모생인데라 야 강라 지 감공마기 시비 제모라 되네 셈 냠바라 주비 두셰 지여와 오 된조 마도바 델레 신비 두셰 탐제라 체만의 제비 두셰스네라 비여 선송하래 다 된조 야강 된조 천만 매바레스 야강의 시제조 된조 디숨데 아니 천만 매바레 디숨 마도바 힘바 된조 아니 두셰 탐제데 아니 천만다 제바 인스
There are many subdivisions. There are as many subdivisions as there are knowledgeable things. Knowable things, not knowledgeable things, knowable things. So there are as many subdivisions of perceptions in light of what we have just seen as there are objects of knowledge, as there are different kinds of phenomena. There are different trees, there are different fruits, there are the sun and the moon, all these different phenomena, right? And we can distinguish as many perceptions in terms of the features and the names as there are objects of knowledge. Everything can be distinguished in these ways, right? But we can also subsume them, and there are some another way of categorizing all these manifold, limitless perceptions into 6 types. And the first 2 types here read, moreover, perceptions can be divided into these 6 types. Perceptions which with characteristics are all the perceptions except for A, the perception of someone unskilled in conventional names, which means being unable even when seeing a form to name it because of not having learned its name. The perception of space without characteristics and the perception of serenity at the summit of existence. and perceptions without characteristics of these three exceptions. So we can divide perceptions into the perceptions with and without characteristics. Without characteristics refers to, for example, a little child that cannot identify things for what they are because it hasn't learned the terminology, it doesn't learn the names, so it cannot identify a tree for a tree even when it appears. So by not knowing the names for things, the child cannot identify what this is, or by not having ever seen something before, not having heard about it, then it cannot identify it. So it's a state of a little child that has not yet learned the terminology and so forth to identify things correctly. So even when it sees something, it doesn't know what it's labeled. Even if it knows the name, it doesn't know what kind of meaning or what kind of object is labeled according to that name. That's one kind of perception that is that is identified as without characteristics. A second one is then the perception of space without characteristics. So that's a meditative absorption state, and then the perception of serenity at the summit of existence. That's the perception at the highest level of the meditative absorptions, where there are no characteristics perceived at all. So in these different states, then we speak about perceptions without characteristics. And any other kind of perception is then a perception with characteristics. So identifying these characteristics.
Sema maybe dushene ane sema da jebi dushe mato bateta tamje res sunre.
So this perception without characteristics involves these three exceptions. So the three exceptions from perceptions with characteristics, the three exceptions that were mentioned, they are then included in perceptions without characteristics.
Dene chungyu dushe singje yo sayang di kya chung dushe kangin baden dokam sheba dokam genne sul den sheba de kya chung res 대신 또 갸침복이 두시에 생겨 디 수감기 내술 된 시행 된 소리 수감데 도감다 삼로 당나 수감데 뱀세게 갸침복이래스 네 사차이나라도 디네 연대니나라도 강제통의 갸침복이래 근데 갸침복 두시에스 양 쳔마메베 두시에스는 남가타에 수메 감지 남가타에 당 남셰 타에스 디니데 셰디민나 쳔메베게 두시에 인생 남가 쳔메바오 아니 남셰 쳔메바오 센데데 셰비고니 아니 찌암메베 두시에스네 찌암메베 단다 수메 계시 무시기나는 찌암 어디기 계시 셰바데 쪽도 에와여스는 쪽도 에와스는다 인겐 말라 쳔마다 제바다 제 쳔마메바다 니 추모당 숨 쳔보당 시 안에 쳔메베당 마 안에 지암메베 두시에당 쪽 어떤 데스네 두시에된라 에와 어떤 데스 유레스 수마리도
Then come the lesser perceptions. Lesser perceptions are perceptions that cause something to be perceived in the desire realms. This is a more narrow kind of vision or narrow kind of perception because it includes less objects, less width or less perceptions than in the higher realms. So it's because it's a little bit more narrow. The perceptions of the desire realm are called here the lesser perceptions. And in comparison to that, then the vast perceptions are the vast perception cause something to be perceived in the form realm. Those are the perceptions in the form realm, which compared to the desire realm are more broad because there are more objects being perceived. There's the realm of perception is bigger. There are more qualities, more characteristics that can be perceived by adding the experiences of the form realm to that of the desire realm. And then the fifth type of perception, or then the immeasurable perception, calls the spheres of infinite space and of infinite consciousness to be perceived. And here we speak then about the perceptions of the formless realms, and the different stages of the formless realms, which are then topped by the sixth type of perception, the perception of nothing whatsoever, causes this fear of nothing whatsoever to be perceived. So that's then the identification of that. And in this way, we have the six classification into six types of perceptions. Oh. So. I will stop here for today, and please let's dedicate and make the aspiration prayers together.
Jambalamba Jidara Kemba Dan Kundo Sambo Deyang Deshen Deda Kunje Jesu Dalo Kiwai Deda Tamje Rando Mo Dusum Shekbe Yalwa Tamje Di Wa Kangla Chodo Ngaba De Dage Kebe Zawa Ndi Gwen Yang Sambo Chechen Rando Mo Wara Ndi Sunam Di Tamje Seba Ni Tomde Nyebe Chanam Pamje Ni Jega Nache Balawe Choba Yi Sebe Chole Drowa Drova Sho Kewa Di Kewa Kun Sonam Yeche Chozo Shin Sonam Yeche Lejongwa Tamba Kunye Tobara Sho Lo Chuso Drovara Chinge Labdo So Chu Lamdo Drovara Chinge Labdo Lam Chulwa Silvara Chinge Labdo So Chulwa Yeshe So Charware Chinge Labdo Solo Naso
Naso Tusinai
Tujichena
Ingala, did you ask a question today?
Question? Yeah. No, I did not. I forgot. What day of the week is today? That's my question.
How many people turn on the camera at the end of the class? Just kidding.
Yeah. Yeah. Just tell me something. My question for today is just tell me something that's on your mind and you want to tell me. Anything counts today.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Türkçe
Inkala.
Yes, Mark. Yes.
Genla. I don't see, looking at attendance quizzes, looking at names and colors and perceiving all that, I don't see anything that says 2020 09 10. I see 0909. I see 0901. I see many things, but I don't see 910 unless, you know,
Let me check. I did